Thanks very much for the invite. I was here about 2 years ago or so, and it was a great time. I think I spoke on some soybean and some fusarium fungicide work. And so my agronomy program mainly is my research program involves corn, soybeans, and wheat, and I'm really interested in sustainable intensification of management or inputs for corn, soybeans, and wheat. And so we're talking about a systems approach here, and I'm also involved with a lot with soil, because soil and crop, of course, they go together very well. And of course, I was very interested in the first two talks that you had here. Okay, so first off, I want to talk about some intensification of soybean, some soybean successes that we've had, and some failures or some practices that didn't work, and I want to talk to you about those as well in Ontario. Okay, and so I should recognize my colleague or cohort, I guess, in the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. His name is Horst Bonner, and so Horst usually takes care of the field scale intensive work, and then I work with Horst, and he works with growers, and I usually do the intensive small plot kind of work as a part of the university. So it's the provincial staff working together with the university staff, and we really have a good synergy going on. And of course, I should recognize my sponsors here. So there's lots of sponsors with this project. My technicians here, and also there's a graduate student involved with this as well. So I have 3 or 4 graduate student openings in my program. And so if you know of anybody that's interested in doing their master's or PhD in work similar to this, more or less in the precision ag field, I have a few sponsorships open starting this spring. Okay, so many of you know or seen this guy before. His name is Kip Cullers, and he has a secret to growing the world record for soybean in the world, which is 160.6 bushel to the acre. And he says his recipe is using poultry manure, early planting, modest plant density, long varieties, overhead irrigation, and a whole bunch of other goodness here. So seed treatments, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, foliar feeding. But the key here is plants with many nodes per pod. And so this is his key to soybean yields, to have plants that look like this at this quite significant plant density. Okay, so this is just not a soybean plant off by itself in the field. So he took this. I think a University of Illinois professor took this shot of one soybean plant amongst others in a soybean stand, and he had a pod number per node that looks something like that. Just incredible. Okay, so a few years ago, my colleague Horst and I, we went through some of the individual projects that we had, and we looked at planting dates, so an early planting versus late planting, and based on that study, we had, or a number of studies, we had 3.8 bushel yield gain, and we looked at tillage, so in a no-till situation, no-till versus maybe one pass with vertical tillage, with an RTS or something like that. This is after green corn, and we averaged about 1.8. And then inoculants, with and without inoculant. And so my part of the world, we have, like, soybeans are grown quite frequently in the rotation. Quite a few farmers or growers, they do not apply inoculants, but some do. So just based on this research data, we have, for ground that has been under soybean history, we do see a response to soybean inoculants. So 1.2 bushel to the acre, and that's just with and without inoculants, a whole array of studies. Cruiser Max seed treatment 1.9, so with and without seed treatment, and some separate experiments, seed treatment experiments 1.9. Foliar fungicides with and without foliar fungicides 2.2, and then extra fertilizer 0.7. And if we add this all up, like if we were to do all of these things, we achieve a higher soybean yield, close to 12 bushel to the acre, if all of these were additive, okay? So some of these could be synergistic, and so we could do maybe 1 or 2 of these and maybe result in a higher yield than just 1 plus 1. So it's not like a 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's a 1 plus 1 equals 3 or something like that. That's kind of a synergistic effect. So we set out a number of experiments to see if we can really add up the yield, and so we looked at this, and so there was something about this, and so this maybe appear to be, just a minor accident, but we look at the whole perspective. Here's the truck over here, and so things could happen, that we don't expect, and that's one of the things that happened in this project as well. There's a few things that we did not expect, and I'd like to show you some of the results. And so these are some of the complex experiments that we set up. And so these are the small plot. So you have planting day with and without pre-tillage, and so no-till with and without vertical tillage, just an RTS with and without seed treatment, with and without phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, soil applied fertilizer, and then we have a number of foliar sprays, and then all these combinations results in 256 plots per location. And so we have 6 locations of this per year, so it really adds up. So this is what I did, what my group did, and then my cohort, he did the field scale stuff, and so he did 10 to 12 locations per year of just a few selected treatments. And so this is how some of our soybeans look like, and so this was our kind of intensive package here versus our non-intensive package. And right away we saw differences in soybean growth. So we saw this out in the field, of course, in the spring, and we thought, hey, this has got to translate into yield, okay? Because it's just so dramatic visual effect. And so we call this a SMART approach, and this stands for Strategic Management Adding Revenue Today. And this was our standard approach with kind of minimized inputs, okay? And so this is our results, and so this is the field scale results. And so untreated, and so no-till practice, no added inputs, 51.5 bushel to the acre. And then we have all of these inputs here, so the kitchen sink, and all of these inputs added about 4 bushel to the acre. And so, of course, the question is, how much do these input cost? And does 4.4 bushel pay for itself? And I'll get more to that in just a little bit later. So that spurred on a new study, a brand new study, and we called this SMART Project 2. And we looked at this in between 2011 and 2013. And this is how soybean yield is formed generally. So we have a fairly small arrow. This is in the vegetative growth. That was the picture that I showed you earlier. Massive differences, but really the yield formation does not occur during that time. And a major part of the yield formation is right during this flowering period, which occurs right around mid-July or so, in through August, when the seeds are filling up. This is when the majority of the yield is made. So the thing is that we cannot be deceived on how the beans look at this stage, because most of the yield is formed during that stage, okay? And so what we need to do is design experiments to look at, to see how we can change, how we can manage our crop to influence this part. And so that's the main part of SMART 2, okay? And so this is taken July 26th, and so we have a very thin canopy here. And so we have these beans don't look like they have a very big yield potential, but they're just starting their flowering process. This was planted very late, okay, and that's what resulted in this. But we had excellent weather in 2011 through the flowering stage, and resulted in yields way above the provincial average of 57 bushel to the acre. And so this really emphasizes, how important that flowering stage is to soybean yield formation, is that all the weather just in that period of flowering is so very important, critically important for high yield production. And of course, we're most interested in flowers that look something like this. Okay, so this is our visual, some of our visuals during the vegetative stage. And again, we saw quite dramatic differences. So SMART 2 soybeans versus the standard. And we have the SMART 2 versus standard here, depending on the inputs here. And then, of course, the beans look so much different than in the standard compared to the SMART 2. So if I can go back and forth here, catch that effect. Pretty cool, eh? So it looks like that. And so this is some of our numbers from the field scale work that we had. We had an adapted variety, and then we had a longer day variety here. And so our major objective is to plant a longer day variety in order to lengthen that seed fill period during those critical R stages. And so variety maturity becomes very important during that time. If we wanted to emphasize that flowering stage, we need to grow a variety that kind of lengthens that stage as much as possible. and that contributed to 2.1 bushel to the acre. And so when we add all these different inputs to that longer day variety, we have another 4.9 bushel to the acre, which results in 7 bushel to the acre. And so in the soybean world, this is extremely significant, okay? 7 bushel to the acre response to management inputs is incredibly huge, okay? For corn and for wheat, it's not so big of a deal, but it's extremely difficult to increase the yield in soybeans due to management because so much of the soybean yield is dependent on the weather. So it really doesn't matter what you do to the soybean crop, a lot of it, most of the soybean yields is dependent on the weather that you get. And so 7 bushel response to input, so this is a management decision that produces 7 bushel yield response. So this is significant. But the question is, okay, how much did that cost, all those inputs cost? And so let's run through it again. And so longer day variety, we ended up with a profit of $25 extra. So we have a 2.1 bushel gain at $12 a bushel, that's about 25. And then we have the different inputs here. So longer day variety puts inputs, 4.9 bushel gain, $59 an acre. And then we have these inputs, so seed treatment, inoculant, seeding rate costs quite a bit, starter fertilizer, $15 an acre, and ammonium sulfate and some nitrogen, $35, and this resulted in a loss of $81 an acre. So 7 bushel to the acre response, but with all these inputs resulted in a loss of $81 an acre, okay? And so the main question is, okay, what can we do? Which inputs are the most important? And we can identify that with these small plot trials. And these are the trials right here that my group arranged and my graduate student worked on for the past 3 years or so. So we have 6 location years. We have a number of different varieties here. And so this was, we were just looking down one of the reps here, and this is a short season variety, or I should say a full season variety. And these other green areas here, these are other varieties, but they are longer season variety than what we would recommend for this area. Okay? And so we have, in this part of the world, we have, in Bridgetown, we have 3,200 corn heat units, and so this variety is a 3,400 heat unit variety here. So it's a little bit longer variety than what is recommended, but we wanted to see if these inputs responded differently on these longer season varieties, because again, those varieties are really making that seed filtration much longer than normal season variety would, so the yield potential will be higher. So we have differences between untreated and a foliar fungicide, so just some downy mildew infestation 14 days after application. And then nitrogen plus fungicide on this side, plus with untreated check on this side, just dramatic visual differences again. And again, in this past year, we had a fairly cold spring, cold soils, and this resulted in significant, I suppose, stunting of the beans compared to where we applied nitrogen fertilizer on the soybeans. It's just tremendous growth differences. Like these soybeans are about half the height as these right here. See some corn residue on the soil surface, so solar radiation is being lost here. And so we were thinking, this is the year for nitrogen application for soybeans because it really had a dramatic effect on the crop growth. Okay, and then we have differences in variety maturity as well. So this is an extra long season variety compared to a full season for the area. You can see this dramatic difference here because this soybean, the seeds are still filling here. The physiological maturity has already reached in those soybeans right here, so they're done. Okay, and so we would expect maybe that our inputs, our extra inputs, would be more responsive here compared to a variety here. So we wanted to test that out as well. And so it did translate into a little bit delayed maturity or a harvest date. So this is one variety here, but intensive inputs with nitrogen plus fungicide on this side versus untreated check, and it did lengthen the seed fill period just a little bit of these inputs here. Okay, so you might say, well, I want this condition because I want to harvest my beans early before maybe inclement weather happens, or you maybe want to plant some winter wheat or something like that, or a cover crop in this scenario. You don't want this, but we're looking at intensifying inputs to generate the highest soybean possible. And once we can figure that out, whether this is responsive or not, then we can fine-tune our system if we wanted to, do something after a soybean crop, or just plant, a few fields into this treatment versus this field, so on and so forth. So we wanted to see how these varieties adapted. So here we have two locations here. So we looked at the adapted variety versus a long season variety here. And so this is our normal application package here, and this is our intensive package. So we have about a 4 bushel yield gain here, and we saw the same thing with our long season variety here. So our inputs, intensive inputs on our long season variety did not seem to give an additional response on the long season varieties, but the long varieties here, they ended up with 2 to 3 more bushel compared to the adapted variety. So variety maturity plays a huge role. And in my part of the world in Ontario, we're rethinking, we can grow extra long season soybean varieties and get that little bump in yield, but unfortunately, because we plant a lot of winter wheat in our area as well, that means our winter wheat's going to be planted quite a bit later. And so we take away from the wheat if we want to add to the soybeans. And so, but if a grower did not want to plant winter wheat, for sure they would plant, as long season variety soybean as possible, because we have excellent trends showing, that variety maturity plays a huge role. Then at Bridgetown, these are just excellent yields in the 60, 70 bushel to the acre, and we saw basically the same thing. So maybe a little bit more response out of the inputs, 4.5 bushel response out of the inputs compared to the adapted maturity variety. But you can see just the differences between the adapted variety here, we have 62 bushel to the acre, and then with intensive long varieties, we have that yield increase there is about 9 bushel to the acre. So that's very respectable in terms of how management can increase soybean yields just by 9 bushel to the acre. That's a tremendous yield increase for soybeans. And so here the costing of this kitchen sink kind of approach with this intensive management, and we have some big ticket items here. So what we want to do is to figure out, which ones here really contribute the most to that 4 or 5 or 6 bushel to the acre response we get. Because if one of these does not contribute very much, we can drop that out, and then our economics would become much better. Okay, and so that's what we wanted to see in these small plot treatments. So I call these omission plots. And so here we have a change from the normal practice. So normal practice here, so this is very important to understand in order to understand this omission plot. So the normal practice is 165,000 plants per acre, no fungicide and no fertilizer nitrogen. That's what we call a normal practice. Okay? If we add nitrogen to it alone, this is our yield response. So you've seen this picture before, just dramatic yield differences here with and without nitrogen. If we add nitrogen to this package, we get 0 yield response. So even though those pictures that I showed you, just huge yield increase, like massive visual differences, it did not translate into the yield at the end of the day. Okay, and so we had some growers saying like, I'm going to apply nitrogen every year because my neighbor applied nitrogen. His beans look fantastic all year, but really you don't get paid by the visual appearance. You get paid by the yield at the end of the day. Okay, so this nitrogen part, it cost quite a bit of money, of $30 an acre, and it didn't pay for itself. And we have a lot of other trials as well, and we just cannot find any added income or profit with adding nitrogen fertilizer to soybeans, even though that we have these huge visual yield differences. Okay, so we wanted to increase our population from 165 to 250,000. So if we just did that to our normal practice here, and so we get very little yield increase here. So this is average across 6 location years, only 0.3 bushel to the acre. And then with and without fungicide, so that's the only thing that we do to this normal package here, we get a yield increase about 1.2 bushel to the acre. So this is a little bit less in this study. This is a little bit less than what we'd expect from a foliar fungicide. And so a lot of our trials, we've seen on average about 2 bushel yield response to a fungicide, but in these trials right here, it just so happens that we averaged around 1 bushel to the acre. Okay? So these inputs right here, they represent different combinations of inputs here. So we have all three. If we incorporated high nitrogen population, high population, and fungicide, our yield increase goes up to 4.6 to 2.6 bushel to the acre. Okay, but if we just dropped out nitrogen in this case, our yield just goes down by 1 bushel to the acre if we drop nitrogen out of this package. So some of these factors, some of these inputs work together. They work together to form this 4.6 bushel to the acre, but when we drop out nitrogen, high population of fungicide resulted in, at Ridgetown at least, a 3.6 bushel to the acre difference. So when we drop nitrogen, it only yield dropped a bushel per acre, but that also dropped our cost down by $30 an acre if we took that nitrogen component out. So that really underlines the insignificance that our nitrogen fertilizer played in that case. And then we dropped out the high population, and when we drop out the high population, our yield goes down about 2 bushel to the acre. So high population was important in this study. And then if we drop out the fungicide part, our yield just goes down by 1 bushel, or goes up by 1 bushel per acre compared to the normal package here. So I realize that this table might be a little bit difficult to understand, but when we drop out the fungicide here, our yield increased with nitrogen and a high population. This is a $60 treatment, and it's only bringing around a bushel to the acre to the table. Okay, and so that really underlines the importance of fungicide in that case. Question back here.
What was the high population?
250,000.
Okay, thanks.
And so that's their seeding rate, and so our actual plant stand was about 10% less than that. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about plant population in a second. So nitrogen high plant population, this is what really decreased our yield. So this is my graduate student here. These beans are not 6 feet tall. He's down on his knees, so I have to come clean up on that. So he is down on one knee, but you can see like this plot is lodged right here. And so that really takes away, we think that really takes away from our yield potential on some of our treatments here. So nitrogen plus high population really contributes that. And these are all the varieties that we tested. This is a percent lodging at our standard population. When we increase our population, see what happens to our lodging here. So this is lodging during or right before harvest. And then when we add nitrogen to this, to the high population, our lodging increases significantly. Like 93% lodging, those beans are flat at harvest. And you can see, like you can imagine what effect that would have on the yield potential of that crop because it destroys much of that canopy architecture. So that definitely plays a role in that. If we had to decide to redesign this experiment, probably we would not go to a high population. We might go with a lower population here just to see if we can get those beans to stand during high intensive input applications. Okay, so lodging was an issue in this case as well. But if we focus on this right here, so high population and fungicide really seems to be the key to maintaining yields above the standard. So 3.6 to 1.7 bushel to the acre over the normal population. So high population, really what we mean here is that the canopy is completely closed at the flowering stage. And so this does not mean packing every plant that we can into the plot before they lodge. Our goal is to have enough plants in that stand in order to intercept most of the solar radiation at flowering time, right when that critical flowering stage happens. And so that's what our ideal population should be at that time. And so we can do that by manipulate that a little bit by row width and whatnot, but we need to have a sufficient population in order to intercept most of that solar radiation when flowering starts at R1 or R2. Okay, and so that's where we tend to see the biggest yield response there. And so we found, my colleague Horst and I, we've done hundreds of trials in Ontario, and we looked at a number of different inputs, and we come up with this, what we call a word cloud. And if you've never heard this before, is that I'm going to show you some titles on the screen, and the bigger the title is, the more impact it has on our soybean yield. So this is like a huge summary from our work in the past 10 years on impact of soybean yields in Ontario. And I've got a few little data points to show with some of these. So planting date, we're going to go through about 12 of them or so. This is kind of like the conclusion slide. And so planting date, we've seen in our trials, we've seen quite a significant difference of planting date. So 5.4 bushel to the acre over 30 days. This is critical for soybean yields. High soybean yields is to have an early planting date. And believe it or not, soybeans can withstand more frost at emergence than corn can. Soybeans have a lower freezing point than corn does, and soybeans can withstand a little bit cooler temperature than corn does. We've seen soybeans frozen in the ground and before they were emerged, and the crop was just fine. We thought it was going to be a replant situation. So a lot of growers in Ontario, they're now thinking, well, we need to get our corn planting equipment as big as possible, right? Get that done as fast as possible because we need to get the soybeans in the ground as fast as possible. So the big news, when I was a student in college, they were saying, a bushel per acre per day, that's what you lose in corn. And it was corn planting date, extremely sensitive, okay? For high corn yields, you need to plant early. For soybean yields, it's just as important as corn, and we've seen that in our trials just over the past decade or so. So 0.5% loss per day, and that is exactly the same it is in corn as well. So soybean planting date, hugely important. Variety is also important as well in our variety performance trials. Our lowest and highest soybean variety could have 15 to 20 bushel to the acre difference. So variety is very important. And also the variety by planting date is important as well. So we have an adaptive variety planted in our normal window of time. And so this is another variety, or a long season variety, but planted in an early window. So this isn't really costing us anything here. We have a 4 bushel yield response here. It's not costing really anything to plant a little bit early. We're not expending, on another input. And we're not expending any more on a long season variety for seed as we would on an adaptive variety. But those two decisions, to plant early and to plant a long season variety early, really makes a difference in our yield. And so this is a very consistent yield response that we get, about a 4 bushel yield response, and that's with no added cost. And so that's very important as well. Crop rotation is extremely important. So in my part of the world, corn, soybeans, and wheat, we try and encourage our growers to have diversified rotations, at least a 3 crop rotation. And this is some of the long-term results from the crop rotation research that I'm doing at Ridgetown. And so this was started about 20 years ago or so. Continuous soybeans, 5 bushel, this is in 2009, 5 bushel, about 50 bushel to the acre. Corn soybean rotation, the soybeans yielded 55 bushel. And in the corn soybean wheat rotation, when we include wheat in the rotation, our yield here was about 5 bushel yield response when we have wheat in the rotation. Just tremendous, and you can see how consistent that is every year. We have a 7 bushel increase there, we have an 8 bushel increase just by adding wheat into the rotation, and then 5 bushel increase in 2013. So again, this does not cost the soybean enterprise anything. We're just following a different rotation. In this case, we're including wheat in the rotation and a corn soybean rotation, and that rotation's giving us between 4 and 8 bushel yield response in our soybeans. There's just tremendous differences in our soybean yield, and it doesn't really cost us any more in any input. Good question?
What do you attribute the yield response to
Yeah, so the question was, what's in the wheat crop? What does the wheat do to cause that yield increase? And so there's a number of factors. We call that a rotation effect or black box effect, because sometimes those factors aren't easily determined. But the fibrous root system of the wheat crop helps to build the soil structure. So we've done a lot of soil quality work. The soil health in the corn soybean wheat rotation is much better than in the corn soybean rotation. In actual fact, the corn soybean rotation has one of the worst soil health parameters. It's almost close to the continuous soybean in terms of soil health. And it's that fibrous root system of the wheat that really helps to build the organic matter. Organic matter is about 0.8% higher in the corn-soybean wheat rotation plots compared to the corn-soybean trials. For the past 18 years, about 0.8% organic matter difference, which is huge. Like 0.8 doesn't sound that much, but 0.8 is huge in terms of increasing or stabilizing your organic matter in the soil. And there's a few other things as well. The fewer, the less frequency we have of soybeans in a rotation, the better our soil structure is and our higher the soybean yield. So there's some plant pathogens and root rots involved in there as well that soybeans are susceptible to. And if we make this a 3-year rotation compared to the 2, we tend to see the higher yields, and those are some of the main factors. First, the question over here.
What was done with the wheat straw and the corn stover?
Yeah, wheat straw and the corn stover, which is these are average between no-till and conventional plowed, and those residues were returned in that case. Yeah. There's another question over here.
Here, we haven't been into soybeans a long time, but we seem to see a trend where you get a better crop the second year on your beans, but these aren't fields that have traditionally had beans for a long time. Why is that?
And so the question is, or the comment was that here, soybeans aren't grown that frequent, and especially on a lot of fields, they don't have that frequency of soybean production. And maybe there's a yield response to beans in the second year versus the first year. And probably that's almost always due to the soybean nodulation. And so there's not enough inoculant maybe applied to the soybean crop, or some of it's not efficiently used by the plant. Second year soybeans, inoculate those soybeans again, and there's enough inoculant left in the soil as carryover. Those soybeans are probably in the second year are not as deficient in their nodulation process as in their first year. And so in the first year, probably they're a little bit nitrogen deficient because the nodulation process didn't kick into gear as quickly because of ineffective nodules or fewer number of nodules. Or it could be a residue situation as well. So soybeans after soybeans, soybeans don't produce very much residue. Maybe the second year soybeans, if you plant them early, they didn't have as much residue to contend with or tie up the nitrogen that was in the soil. So I appreciate any other comments regarding that as well. It's just my guess, I suppose, without looking at those treatment differences. Question?
Yeah, Dave, do you have the same research done with spring wheat or spring cereals?
Yes, my cohort in the Ministry of Provincial and Ministry of Agriculture and Food did also do some work with spring wheat as well, and we are seeing some similar differences in this rotation effect with spring wheat as well. So all the spring crops, so spring wheat, spring barley, and oats, they seem to all have the same rotation effect as the winter wheat does. Okay. So how am I for time, by the way? 10 minutes? Okay. So that's rotation. 8 minutes. Okay. I'm not sure what to think about that. 6, 4. So these words are very big, and so the next ones, these are very important, okay, in soybean management. Again, these are conclusion slides from our past several years. Tillage is very much smaller, and so with and without tillage, so this is a kind of a very emotional point with a lot of growers, like how much tillage do you need? Because really tillage really reinforces that visual appearance of soybeans during the vegetative stages. So if your neighbors do some tillage, soybeans all come up nice and uniform, that crop looks fantastic. But it looks fantastic vegetatively, which might not have a huge effect on the yield. And it does show in our trial data as well. So tillage responses vary. There's a lot of tillage differences between no-till and intensive tillage. It's like a plow situation. And they vary from a lot of zeros, to 2 bushel to the acre at the most. And of course, if you don't do tillage, plant no-till, you're saving a lot of land preparation costs and, of course, soil quality issues down the road as well, which are hard to cost. And so tillage is very much a smaller word, I guess, or smaller importance compared to other to other factors. So we'll apply P and K. So our provincial recommendations are, they look to be fairly strong in terms of soybean yields today are in our 40s, 50, 60 bushel to the acre, and our recommendations are based on soybeans when they yielded between 25 and 35. But still, when soil tests recommend P and K, we still seem to see a big yield response in those situations where the soil test recommends the P and K. If the soil test does not recommend P and K, we don't see much yield impact. So this word could be very big depending on your soil nutrient status, or it could be very small depending on your soil nutrient status as well. So the planter type, so we've done a lot of studies looking at row unit type planters versus drills, and our planter type, very consistent yields between 1.5 to 2 bushels more than a drilled soybean crop does, and that's because of the plant-to-plant uniformity. That's the main factor responsible for those added yield increases just with a row unit planter versus a drill. So that's something to look into. We've done 3 years of studies, lots of different replicated trials, and on average it's about 1.5 bushel difference, which is statistically different with a row unit planter versus a drill.
Have you done a cost analysis on that?
A cost analysis would depend largely on the equipment that you're thinking about. And so I know some growers in Ontario, have put together their own row unit planter, which is very cheap, and then others go, full throttle kind of on the most expensive planter that they can find and look at, 60-foot drill or 60-foot air seeder or something like that. Row unit planter could cost $150,000. So it really depends on the planter you're using. But the yield response, about 1.5 bushel to the acre, then you have to work out the cost associated with that for yourself. This is depending on what your machinery goals are. The population does not have a huge effect if you have an annual plant stand. So that's a fairly small word. And then we have inoculation and seed treatment. And so these could be very large words, right? Very important to the soybean production system. Of course, if you're in first year soybeans, inoculant could be the biggest word here out of them all, because inoculant would be very important. If you have an insect issue, soybean aphids or whatnot, seed treatment could be or any soil insect seed treatment could be a fairly large word as well. But on average, our plots over hundreds of trials, about 2 bushel to the acre on a seed treatment. And foliar fungicide, about 2.1 bushel to the acre. That's what our average is across the hundreds of trials that we've done. And so I just want to show some recent fungicide data here. So this is untreated Czech, so this is just last year. Then we tried this foliar fertilizer. It's called KP+. It's marketed by NutraAg. And so they were promoting, NutraAg was promoting application of this foliar product on the R stages. And so this nicely paid for itself. This is one location, at another location with similar results as well. Headline resulted in about a 3 to 4 bushel yield response in this case. And then when we combine headline and KP+, again, the KP+ just paid for itself nicely. And this is BSF's new fungicide. It's called Preaxor. And it's yielding very consistently 1 to 2 bushels more than the headline fungicide is, which is very encouraging. Again, to get 1 bushel more out of soybeans is incredible. And then when we added KP+ to that, there was no yield difference compared to the Preaxor itself. And this was applied at R2.5. And so this is R2. So R2 is full flowering. So this is very important to note, the growth stages. If we want to modify, do treatments in soybeans at the R stages, we need to figure out and standardize ourselves what these R stages mean. Okay? And so this is very important for growers and agribusinesses to follow. And so R2 for soybeans is when there's a flower on one of the 2 upper nodes. R3 is when there's a pod 3/16 of an inch long on one of the 4 upper nodes, and R4 is when there's a pod at least 3/4 of an inch long on one of the 4 upper nodes. So R2, R3, and R4. And it's just very interesting to note that in our timing study, we applied a fungicide here, which resulted in these quite significant yield increases. But when we applied at R4, we did not get those same yield responses. And this is at Ridgetown in 2013. And at Exeter, at another station, we had the same trials and different timings. And R4 timing here, again, did not result in very big yield increases over the untreated chet. So this is very interesting. So in all of our trials that we've done in our SMART trials, the chemical companies told us, hey, you've got to apply at R3 or even a little bit later than R3, between R3 and R4. But in these timing trials, we were looking at R2.5 versus, sorry, there we go. So R2.5, this is early compared to our previous trials in our agronomic work. Our chemical companies, the chemical companies representatives said, hey, you got to apply between R3 and R4. But they also tell me, after seeing this data, that these results that they have, the recommendations are based on US data. And so we're thinking that in Ontario, at least, maybe this timing should be a little bit earlier, and maybe we can see a bigger response to fungicide. So this is brand new information, so we're going to try to, we've got some dollars, BSF is contributing quite a bit of dollars to look at this timing effect in this year and probably next year as well. So these are the results that you've seen right there. And then foliar insecticide, of course, depending on whether or not you have insects or not. And so this word is relatively small. And then foliar P and K, this very small word right here. And a lot of our studies, we showed absolutely no yield effect in these SMART trials. And so this is a kitchen sink study that we looked at. These are the yields. So all those factors included 66 to 59. And we add foliar nitrogen to the R stages, no yield increase. And we add 316-16, no yield increases again. And this is averaged over 6 location years. So we're not too excited about foliar P and K. And so that's why that word is very small. And you might just kind of, this is small on purpose, and that is nitrogen. So that's our nitrogen that we applied. And even though that has big visual, very small word, and it didn't have very much effect. Okay? So any questions? And the question was, for our foliar fungicides, what diseases are we looking at? So our major diseases are Septoria brown spot and some downy mildew. Okay, so soybean disease picture for is very. We don't have very many soybean diseases in Ontario, but a lot of growers are interested in this response to fungicide, especially when soybeans were at $15, $16 an acre, and then some of the IP premiums made that $20 an acre, $20 a bushel. And a lot of growers were interested, hey, if I can apply a fungicide and get 2 bushels, that's $40 an acre increase. And so we do see disease control with those Septoria brown spot and downy mildew, and sometimes it results in yield increases with control of those diseases. But it's very difficult to figure out what is causing those yield increases with fungicide, and it doesn't tend to be associated with disease very much. I think. Sorry. White mold. Yes, white mold is extremely important, especially when you get canopies that tend to want to lay down and lodge. So a high population work and nitrogen, you can imagine a canopy that lodges, we would tend to get a lot of white mold in those plots as well. So big danger there, but in our studies we did not see white mold, but we know of a lot of growers that they did that to their field, they would get white mold. And so the best that we can do is to plant, at a population that's not going to cause the beans to fall over. If your field is in white mold, we can widen the row spacing, that would help. So move away from 7.5-inch rows and go to, maybe wider than 15s and go to something in between 15 and 30 if you wanted to make a planter, for that. So row width is very important. And the best fungicides that we have for white mold are just ones that cause suppression. So it doesn't cure the disease, but at least it suppresses the disease for white mold. Yeah.
You talked about the difference in the years and the amount of moisture played. So if you have access to irrigation, would that not be part of the whole thing? Like Kip Muller has irrigation.
Yes, Guelph has irrigation. And irrigation is extremely important. So that water timing in the R stages, that is the key. So it's the weather during that time, and it's the rainfall during that August time frame during the R stages. And so even when your soybeans don't look water stressed, and my colleague at the university, he has some drought tolerant studies, and even though the beans do not look visually like they're lacking water, they turn out to be, you get a yield response with irrigation in that case. So beans are very sensitive to water stress. Okay. We have one more question, maybe.
Several slides back, you showed the yield graph on the side that is a whole lot higher than any of the other yields that we see in all the trials. I don't know if it's just on your relating to the type of fungicide or not, but I was just curious where I think I see the scale going from 70 to around 90. What goes out?
Yeah,
Development.
so your question is, what is causing this?
Well,
Or is that?
great, or you've got up at the 89, 90 level there, and all the other trials that are talking were in the 50s.
Oh, yes.
Something there in the 60s. So what's special about this graph?
Yeah, this is a fantastic piece of ground that we had at Ridgetown that this trial was on. And so this trial is not part of that other data set that we saw. So we planted these soybeans in early. We have high organic matter, very well tiled, and a high yielding late bean. Okay, and that's what caused these just fantastic soybean yields right here.